really lovely to see you here. I want to welcome everyone online because I know we've got a lot of people watching on YouTube as well, and our wonderful speakers. Iona Lawrence is Associate for the Relationships Project and former Director of the Joe Cox Foundation. Danny Kruger is the MP for Devices and one of the founders of the new Social Covenant Union. Thoughts and questions from people in the room and on YouTube as well, because I know we have huge expertise and knowledge within the audience as well as the panel. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Iona. I think because of your job title, running the Relationships Project, you can tell us what this all means.
Oh gosh, I'll have a go. Well, thank you very much for bringing us all together. Really appreciate it. This is something that we get really excited about, and I'm sure that if you've given up a wet evening, you probably give a bit of a damn about it too. So, quick bit about me. I am freelance and have the pleasure of working about 80% of the time with a whole range of clients on things related to loneliness, social isolation and stronger relationships. So that sometimes looks like the kind of big esoteric stuff we're here to talk about this evening, and that some of it is fundraising for grassroots organisations working in relational ways who are struggling to find resources for their work. And then about 20% of my time, I help charities and organisations close when their time has come, and how you steward not just endings at the end of an organisation, but in the midst of them, like when a chief exec wants to stand down or a founder wants to step down. Both of which I'm going to draw on this evening, but the Relationships Project, which takes up about 2 days of my week at the moment, was founded by someone that many of you might know, because he's really a significant leader and pioneer of this particular agenda. He is a community worker by trade and set up Community Links, and he set up the Relationships Project about 4 or 5 years ago with Imi, his co-pilot, and we exist around 2 core beliefs. Sorry? I didn't mention that. Oh gosh, David Robinson. So we exist around 2 key things. The first is that we believe if you design relationships if you believe that they should be a core central consideration, whether you're designing a housing block, whether you're thinking about what a public service should look like, what you're thinking about what sort of bit of social infrastructure you need, if you start by considering what are the relationships that you want to design into this, then you'll get better outcomes across all measures. So you think about health or housing or basically anything. And we know this because it's a universal human thing, right? We are like social, and we all do it differently. Like some of us introverts, some of us extroverts, but we are hardwired for connection. We also do this, we also know this because the evidence increasingly says it. But if that's what we believe, the second thing we believe is that we're not alone in this, and that this is a kind of emergent, thriving field where there is relational practice pretty much anywhere you can look, but at the moment it's fragmented and disconnected, and it is that is holding us back. It's that why we're having this conversation this evening, and why it feels a bit marginal, because despite its prevalence, there isn't a kind of a paradigm or an orthodoxy. So, Polly said, could I set the seed a bit? So I'll give it a go. Just to be clear, we don't have all the answers on this. Like, we might be called the Relationships Project. Our hunch is that there's an emergent field here and we're trying to bring it out. So you don't look to me for all the answers, but I'll give you a set of things that I think we're thinking about that might be useful to frame this. So the state of relationships in our society right now reveals what we believe is some of our deepest and most sacred values, or where they're broken. So political orthodoxies and operating principles have for too long venerated self-interest and individualism. And that has bled into every aspect of our lives. It's like infected not just who we are and how we live and how we relate with each other, but then it's just multiplied into the organizations and institutions that we make up. And this means that we have developed organizations and services that compete in silos. They're impersonal, they're centralized, they're defensive, they're mistrustful and fearful, they're transactional, codified, and of course they're bureaucratic. And all of this means that meaningful relationships have systematically been displaced by fast and shallow connection in all parts of our shared and common life. There is kind of, looking at COVID is a useful way of thinking, I think, about what an alternate reality could look like. So there were 2 key things that happened in COVID. All of us have different experiences of them, and they weren't universal. But the first is that there was this mass re-neighbouring and forging of new and deeper, stronger relationships between citizens, rather than citizens and the state, or citizens and the market. And that was one of the most remarkable features of the early stages. And we all know the statistics. I'm not going to repeat things you already know, but broadly 40% of us, for a period, felt a stronger sense of connection. But alongside that, we also saw the emergence of behaviours within public service institutions and the professional voluntary sector, which mirrored and complemented this. So these behaviours, and this is crucial for framing some of this stuff, were principle-led rather than rules-based. They were cemented by solidarity rather than compliance. They were often less defensive, more can-do, kinder, more emotionally responsive, led by people on the ground. It was personal and human. And now, as economic pressures pile into COVID's legacy and households and communities blasted by years of austerity face new needs with services stretched to absolute breaking point, relationships are more important than ever before, but they are all too often considered the fluffy extra, the frilly thing, the thing that you're like, but my first order priority is getting people off the streets, and then we'll worry about the relationships. And we would say it's not either or. This is like a false dichotomy. You need to consider relationships in the design of everything, and if you leave them out, you're going to get worse outcomes of the very things that you're saying you want. So we're hopeful. Yesterday I had the pleasure of being in Newcastle for an entire day where we had 100 relationship-centred practitioners from across the UK. In the room were social workers, community organisers, grant makers, local authorities, coaches, educational psychologists, palliative care nurses, services designers, and many more. And what was clear in this room was that there is an emerging, and as I said earlier, abundant field of relational practice. And what was clear to us in that room is that whilst we've edged away from those sort of early pandemic ways of working, and we've moved back towards a pre-pandemic way of working, the future of services to the people in this room was clear that it's not services as we probably understand them, i.e. not kind of about the transaction between a person or a client and the state or a state agent, and much more about the relationships between citizens rather than citizens and the state or citizens and the market. And this is important not because that then absolves the state of any responsibility, but it should therefore become the state's primary interest to kind of create the conditions and context for relationships to thrive. And for anyone who then wants to say, well, haven't we tried this before? This is just big society, like revitalized. I mean, as we've got the kind of in-government expert on my right, I'm not going to say too much about this, but like this isn't like a cut-price big society. It's the refounding of the state. It's a serious, lasting investment in strong communities, relationship education, and so much more that then, as I say, creates the conditions for relationships in communities to thrive, and the state then becomes the enabling kind of factor in that. So there are three things I'm going to leave you with. The first is, as I say, there is lots of good stuff going on. We will all know it, right? There's stuff that like gets us out of bed every day, whether it's in services as we know them or in communities, all of which is relational. But the sum of the evidence is insufficiently compelling because it's dispersed across many disciplines. We're all using different language, measurement is contested, and best practice is fragmented. So we at the Relationships Project are focused on, and are keen to work with others also, Demos being one of our many friends in this, developing the study of relational work, or relationship-centered practice, as a collaborative, interdisciplinary space. This is a hugely promising field, and is also a humongous one. We can barely even see the edges of it, and we don't want to define it in a way that says you're not part of this. So every collaboration will help us understand it better and bring in the harvest. So the second is that we believe this is a big soul-shaping idea. This speaks, as I said earlier, to the very deepest and most important values that we have. And everywhere we look, we see one place, one term, relational wonders. Councils that have done something incredible, a particular place that have done something brilliant. But it doesn't last beyond a few years or a single locality, because, wonderful though the work might be, it dances around the edges of our established orthodoxies, the operating principles at the heart of our society. So we believe putting relationships first is a big soul-shaping idea. It has a built-in capacity for lasting momentum. Just by doing it, we grow, and then we grow the field. Every time we choose to build a relationship in place of a transaction or a process or structure, we take another step closer to the new dawn, and talking about it across sectors and across silos and in concert begins to change the soul of our teams, our organisations, our society and our institutions. Now, third and finally, a thought on how this all calls for us to attend to sort of better endings so that we can get this next phase right. As I said, I spend a lot of time supporting organisations to close well, and a lot of that is not just because I think things need to end, but because what comes next is the exciting stuff. And the status quo is evidently broken, and in many places, despite the efforts of thousands of people, causing harm, not healing, suffering, not flourishing. Existing broken institutions, organisations and programmes are being held up by many passionate, dedicated people who fought for years, if not decades, to keep the show on the road. Part of what is needed is about supporting people who are working against the odds, often with the very best of intentions, to let go of what they have been convinced is the best of a bad set of options, behaviours and approaches. This is not done by purely listing things that are broken and wrong. This invokes the sort of defensiveness, shame and hardening of resolve we've all encountered personally and professionally. Besides, the majority of people working in public services are well versed in the critique and challenges they're a part of. But by stewarding the conversation away from blame, from problems, towards one that grapples with the emotional side of how and what needs to be let go of, we pave the way to a brighter, more relational future.
Thank you. And thank you for a big dose of hope on a very wet and miserable evening. You reminded me of an example that just came to mind as you were speaking, and it's I'm afraid it is my son's school. But during COVID, they opened up the playground to let families that didn't have gardens just have an outdoor space to play when all the playgrounds were closed. And they suddenly saw the resource they had in the playground. And then after COVID, they opened up the playground after school for 2 hours every evening, but with no supervision. So it was just for families to use. But what you then saw was each of the class WhatsApp groups started getting together and watching each other's kids and freeing up an hour and a half, 2 hours of each other's time. And so it was kind of the state leaning in, seeing it had a resource that communities would build around. And the strengthening of the community just from that one little intervention was just so powerful. I think it really spoke to what you were saying about enabling communities as well. And I really want to come back to the big society point as well. But Danny, do you want to go?
Thanks, Polly. Well, thank you. And I know that's so beautiful, and I'm really inspired by what you said. And I'm not going to be able to do it justice in my remarks, but I do really share the point you just made about this is soul-shaping stuff. This is a very, very revolutionary idea we've got that we all share, and it's a very exciting moment. I mean, I've been saying it's an exciting moment for 20 years, talking this kind of language. But the moment does feel right for a new relational model and paradigm, as you say. I mean, and we can have a political dispute over this. And I was very involved in the whole big society experiment. And as a conservative, I blame liberalism. All the problems you've just described, the hyper-individualism and transactional social model we've got. But this is definitely a job for everybody, and even liberals are welcome to help construct the future. And the left have a massive contribution to make. I mean, I think the three traditions, conservative, liberal and socialist, they all have relational ideas in them. And I think, I've talked about this before, but I think there's a radical consensus latent in our public conversations that isn't being acknowledged because of our political disputes, which is probably healthy, because the minute you have a real consensus, the minute you have a public consensus, you're excluding the public. There's a value in adversarial politics because it's a competition to attract public support, and you don't want everyone getting together behind closed doors and saying let's have a relational politics. You want to be disputing this and contesting it, but nevertheless we are, I think, fighting over common ground, and we have the opportunity to construct something new out of the crisis, prolonged crisis that we're in, which we can describe as nature and causes. It's the period of it, but certainly acute right now. So I mean, just to frame it politically, and thinking about those three political traditions, I think there is the contest is between the triad of the French Revolution: liberty, equality, and fraternity, meaning solidarity, now less gendered word. But those are the three ideas, and I think it's that third one, solidarity, that is the opportunity and the battleground. Because liberty and equality, I mean, necessary as they both are, and let's not repudiate those concepts. Nevertheless, a dispute between them is what's got us into this mess, and we have sacrificed the third pillar, as it were. In fact, there's the phrase that's often used to describe the civil society piece of our economy and our social economy that gets neglected. I just been talking about, what you just mentioned, Polly, as well. So we need to recover solidarity, fraternity, whatever we want to call it, a relational idea. My experience, just to sort of personalise it like I did, I've been in and out of politics all these years, but I've also run charities for quite a long time. I spent 10 years running a charity working in prisons and with ex-prisoners. And we started that thinking we were setting up an arts project, working in prisons, theatre, music projects in prisons and with ex-offenders, which is indeed what the project did, it still does now. But what we realised quite quickly is that, and we talked about the value of creativity, which I can rhapsodise about as a really important thing for helping ex-offenders or prisoners to reform. But actually, what we realised we were doing quite quickly was building community. It was the relationships that were making a difference, and creativity was the means by which you create a relationship. The cost of a theatre production are going to be changed through the experience, and it's not just the creative experience. That is primarily not the creative experience; it's the relational experience. And so that project now carries on, and we make much more of a focus on the role of relationships, while we also do creative projects. Then after that, or in parallel with it, I set up a project working in West London Children's Zone, and that West London Zone for children and young people. What that does is the same kind of principle at an organisational level, and the insight there was each charity, including Only Connect, the prison charity that we'd set up, had this essential lie at its heart, which is that we alone are going to fix the problem in front of us. And this is definitely, the funding system induces this, incentivizes it. We are going to go out, we see this problem, we've got the answer to it, we'll fix it, and insofar as anybody fixes up their life, it was because of us, not them, and certainly not anybody else in their life. Whereas actually that's obviously untrue. What gets you into trouble is a whole confluence of forces. What gets you out of trouble is a confluence of forces, and one individual organisation, even though often is one key relationship, as we know from all the research and our own experience, it often is one relationship that matters, teacher and parent, whatever. But crucially, we inhabit an ecology, and we need the support of a multitude of agencies in our lives, particularly people in trouble, because they get so many agencies in their lives. So the West London Zone is about putting together these different organisations and providing a hub that supports, identify them, about the West London Zone for children and young people, and that acts as a sort of hub for support for kids on the edge of risk. So a relational approach is well. Get into politics and policy now. I mean, you just said what a very powerful phrase, sentence. The job of the state is to create the conditions for relationships, something like that. So I think, and I say a lot, the purpose of politics, what we're all here for in politics, political life, and politics is not just about what happens at Westminster. It's the business of the management of strangers. We're all in politics. But the purpose of politics is to cultivate the conditions of virtue. And by virtue, I mean the skills and the habits that make us great people, make us good people, and the things that basically the human beings are naturally good at. And they're essentially relational skills, like patience, and compassion, and courage, and self-restraint, and generosity, all these qualities. And so rather than providing stuff, which is what transactional liberal politics has given us, as a paradigm. The real paradigm should be how does the state and the wider politics, including civil society, including schools, which I don't regard as state institutions, how do the institutions of our political life, our civil life, create conditions of virtue? And I would, and I'll end with just a couple of thoughts. So the new social covenant, covenant is this idea, Jonathan Sachs wrote about it very well, biblical idea, that is about the sort of permanent obligations that people have to each other, which is distinct from a contract, which is essentially temporary and conditional, and you can walk away from it. Covenant is sort of permanent. And I think we need covenantal relationships, not contractual ones, and we need to, and those are what create conditions of virtue, and those relationships are best found, and what we should be actively doing is trying to strengthen the associations that make us virtuous, which are families, communities, and nations. So those are the things we need, and they're a reason why people are really passionate about those things, about family, about their family, about their community, and their nation. We should never denigrate those impulses because they're essential, because they're virtuous. And so we need, those things need to be sovereign in a sense. So I'm a big Brexiteer for that reason, so I think nations are meaningful. But they're not autonomous, so nations should not be isolated. So we shouldn't be drawing up the drawbridge. So as a Brexiteer, I very much strongly believe in international relationships and being part of global partnerships. Communities need sovereignty, but they're not autonomous either. They need to be part of a wider political system. But we do, so leaving the nations, I was saying, on the community bit, I mean, I think the NHS is fundamentally ill-designed for the times we're in. It was probably appropriate to an era in the 1940s when you had strong families and communities. I think now we need to decentralise the NHS radically. You've just been in Newcastle, and I don't know if you came across the social prescribing project. I think it's in Gateshead, I don't know if it's, which has done incredible work to reduce acute demand on the state, because just through civil society, massive savings, and of course improved outcomes for people through the social prescribing model there. Social prescribing isn't working everywhere, it works in places, and there's a really brilliant example of it in the North East. So if you can decentralise the NHS and the social care system, we maybe get onto that. And I totally agree, the big society was a kind of toe in the water of what we're talking about here. It was around the edges, the reason we could explore. We are talking about refounding the state, and that's well put. And lastly, you mentioned the nation, communities and families, and I think that the sort of sidelining of families is so much at the root of our problem, because we're so anxious about moralising and telling people what families should look like. Actually, we just kind of know what a family looks like, and I think there is a normative model that we shouldn't be ashamed of upholding. But whatever the shape of the family, that is the key institution that supports people at risk and could support many more. And we need to be strengthening it. And I'll end with one policy proposal, as we'll out for a policy proposal, in care, whether it's for children's care, childcare, or for adult social care. We basically subsidise remote, large-scale statutory provision or private sector provision, rather than subsidising families to look after their kids and their elderly people. So you get more money for putting your elderly parent into a residential home than you get if you keep them in their own home or bring them to live with you. So we are incentivising the outsourcing of what is really a family responsibility. And I think the job of the state should be to support the family to do what families want to do, basically. And it should be a sort of enjoyed to do. Not too offensively, but slightly encouraged to do the right thing, which is what most families want. So I think we should be shifting the incentives to support families rather than our efforts to help people actually putting families apart. So there are some thoughts.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Loads to talk about there, but let's hear from Alex first. Alex.
Thanks. Hopefully you can hear me okay. I'm coming through on the audio, great. So I was just really struck that we're talking about taking a relational approach as something that's a radical idea, or that is, that's currently something that's peripheral to services. I was thinking, well, what is a public service? And we often sort of immediately jump to something quite technical, quite medical, some sort of, people performing surgery, or a very practical task for somebody who needs support to get up and get dressed and so on. But increasingly, public service is a long-term relationship, and actually I think you could make the argument that the vast majority of what our public services do is they form a relationship, and they create the framework for a relationship between two people, somebody who's looking for some kind of support and somebody who wants to offer some kind of support. So it should be central, and it shouldn't feel like a radical idea to say that this is the central function of our public services. So I work for the Mayday Trust, which is an organisation which redefined itself and everything it does around a different form of support relationship. So we were a traditional support and housing charity working in the homelessness sector, and that was going perfectly well from the charity's perspective. But my predecessors about 10 years ago carried out a listening exercise, which you can still find on our website, called Wisdom from the Streets, which was about actually listening to what mattered to people and not asking them how could we improve a service, but what does a good life look like, how could we get there. And what that allowed people to do was to tell us not only that what we were doing in the traditional approach wasn't working, but actually it was part of the problem. And they identified some problems with traditional support approaches, which led us to completely rethink everything we do. So they said that we were obsessed with their problems, and we could only see their problems, and often only one problem at a time, and that had led us to have an inflated belief that we could fix people, and that was stopping them from taking control of their own lives. And it was also leading us to create segregated services that could be really difficult to get into, because you've got to meet exactly the right eligibility criteria, but then also really difficult and risky to leave, not just because you're leaving a whole load of support that you've become dependent on behind, but you may also be leaving all of your relationships behind as well when you leave that support. So Mayday did something that charities never do. They said, right, well, we'll just stop doing that then, and dismantled several decades of work and went to look for something different to do instead. And we drew on ideas from elite sport coaching and executive coaching, the kind of sport that you or I might look for if we were going through a tough time, to develop a model of coaching we call the PTS response. And we've been developing and helping other organisations to deliver and delivering it ourselves, that response for 10 years now, and then taking the learning from that to try and design and advocate for a public service system that thinks and works very differently. So the BTS response stands for a person-led, transitional and strengths-based, and the idea is that it's a relationship-first approach. So that's the key part, is we do lots of measuring of outcomes and impact, but we manage. We recruit people through a very relational, values-based approach that enables them to take on roles which are much more autonomous than the roles we often box people in public services, because we don't trust them, essentially. So we take these incredible caring, creative people, and then we create tiny little boxes for them to work in. So this turns that on its head. It's about getting to know people really well, recruiting people into roles where they can be much more autonomous, and so that they can take an approach to working with people which is first and foremost about forming the right relationship, because the evidence suggests you've got to do that before anything else good can happen. So we do some social prescribing work with Bridges Outcome Partnership at the NHS in Northants, which is often for people that have are sort of coming into contact with the public service system, but we also work still in the housing and homelessness sector with people who have been let down by multiple services, sometimes for decades. Either way, we do not start with whatever their problems are, even if they're in crisis. So a coach was talking to me earlier about work that she did with somebody who had as many risk labels as you can have, really, about to lose yet another hostel, a significant heroin problem, lots of other risk factors. But that cycle of crisis and crisis response had him stuck, it had the services stuck. Nobody could see beyond his problems. And through just getting to know him on his own terms safely in the community, she was able to identify that, actually he was able to identify that he had an interest, and if for him it happened to be CrossFit, that had been something that he used to like doing. So through the relationship and through pursuing an activity together that he was able to do on his terms, that had nothing to do with the presenting crises. They were able to go on a journey which enabled him not just to reduce his drug intake, because if he wanted to take part of the activity, he realized he had to take less drugs than he had been doing, but also to form a whole set of new relationships in the community that he hadn't done before. And then for the coach gradually to withdraw and let him navigate his own life again. And that kind of is the theme that comes out of that work. We deploy personal budgets, which are also about giving people back that control, so people having amounts of money available to them that can unlock things, whether it's the Chromebook for a woman that was wanting to take part in college and kind of get back into education, something to do with housing that could make the difference between a new housing being sustainable or somebody potentially ending up back on the streets. But the idea of putting that control of both the relationship and everything else we do back with the person, and that's the fundamental reform that we think needs to be at the heart of public service reform. Before I joined Mayday back in January, I worked for over 10 years with the shared lives sector, which is another relationship-based approach in which people share their home and family life with people that need support, rather than people moving into care homes and other forms of support. I wrote a book from those experiences called Escaping the Invisible Asylum. I called it that because through immersing myself in the work of people who thought relationship first and talked about all of the things we never talk about in public services, they, instead of talking about quality and risk assessments and cost benefit, they tended to talk about love and fun and the messiness of ordinary life. And it made me feel that actually, although we like to think we've demolished our asylums and our workhouses and all those big buildings we used to physically separate people into, we were still, in our services, although we were calling them community services, we still had the idea of two groups of people, the them and the us, deeply ingrained into everything we were doing. So we didn't have so many physical thresholds and gateways for people to cross over, but we had plenty of eligibility thresholds, we had plenty of gatekeepers. We had, I was hearing families who were experiencing the health and care service for the first time talking about falling down a rabbit hole into a world which spoke its own language, which didn't really see them as full people, as full citizens. And we were making people give up that citizenship in order to access services. So through the work that I'm learning about still in Mayday Trust with this coaching approach, and through the work he used to do with shared lives and those relational approaches, it just really struck me that there is a different way of doing this. That we can actually recognise that a public service is first and foremost a relationship, and increasingly the problem we can't fix is that relationship. We're going on really long, really complex support journeys, and yet we're throwing a succession of often expert, well-qualified strangers at people with a whole cycle of referrals, information, case openings, case closing, and then we're wondering why people aren't achieving a good life. What we're looking for, and you can use these models which take that to its logical extreme, but also you can learn from them for any public service, is a way of offering people support through a smaller number of more chosen, deeper, more reciprocal relationships, which offer more in terms of choice, control, respect, but actually demand more of people as well. So people are able to take control, because actually there's this fear in public services that if we open the floodgates, as the language that's always often used, because we have been starving services of resources for years now, that there will be this endless need. And actually the reality is that people don't want public services in their lives more than they have to. If they have the security of knowing that this relationship is on their term, they ask for less rather than for more, and they want to get public services, they want to move beyond public services or to minimise the amount of and public service in their life, not because those things aren't vital and crucial to their lives, but because we want to control our lives as much as possible. So that's the big idea. I think that's what we need to be looking for, not an reorganisation of our visible and invisible asylums, but actually a complete fundamental rethink of that core relationship that happens when somebody offering support meets somebody who's looking for support.
Thank you. And it's not often that you have kind of essentially policy conversations like this when the word love is used, and I think that's a kind of marker of a good conversation actually in these kind of policy circles. And it reminded me as well of Josh McAllister's review of children's social care, which really looks at a more relational, preventative way of working. And that report has the word love in, I think, 56 times. And for a kind of independent review of a big government service, that's a kind of revolutionary, I think. And I thought I have a few questions. I'm keen to kind of bring in thoughts and contributions from the floor and from YouTube, Felix, if you're keeping an eye as well. But I thought kind of splitting it into two parts. I want to dig a little bit deeper into kind of what relational means to you, and then let's just think about what are the conditions we need to make this change, if it is as revolutionary and ambitious as we have all articulated here. So kind of thinking about what relational means, I want to go back, I'm sorry, to the big society, kind of what's the same and what's different. So Danny, I'm going to ask everyone that question if it's okay.
What's the same, what's different now and then? Well, I mean, the idea is the same, and I was around then. I mean, I worked with David Cameron in opposition when he was sort of cooking up these ideas. I wrote the Hugger Hoodie speech, of blessed memory, which talked about love, and I think this insight is nobody thought it up. Except our very distant ancestors, because this is the essential idea. I think that what's different and what, in a sense, what was wrong with big society, it didn't deliver. It wasn't big enough. It wasn't transformational. I mean, in a sense, it was hobbled by austerity, but actually, austerity sort of enabled the big society in places as well, because it required people to change. Wigan is a great example. Labour Council, which reformed social care in particular, children's services as well, in response to budget constraints, and ended up delivering a better service, saving the front line, and balancing the books. So I'm afraid, I mean, I think, guys, if we're serious about this, we've got to take on some sacred cows of our own. Mine on my side is the market isn't going to fix this on its own. And there is a big role for the state. On the other side, the money isn't the answer either. Certainly pouring more money into an unreformed system would be a disgraceful thing to do, given the economics of the moment. So I think reform is vital, and I challenge people who talk, as we just heard, and that was very, very powerful, about a completely new model. Well, that means taking on the 1940s settlement and really being serious about reform. If we're serious, it's going to be tough. I think what we need to do is grasp that nettle. I mean, it's interesting, Patricia Hewitt's just been appointed by the government to look at the integrated care boards. Okay? Might or might not be interesting. Big say. She, former health secretary, Blair era health secretary, now running one of or chairing one of these integrated care boards. Government's asked her to look at how they're working. What they are potentially in microcosm, or sort of prototype, is a new localised NHS that includes social care, which the NHS never did, and it was centralised. What we have here is a local combined health and social care commissioner. That is profoundly significant, potential. I mean, this, it really absolutely could do what you guys and the previous colleague was writing about, whether it will or not. But I think it's interesting, and I think it's quite. I don't know. Let's see how radical Patricia's and our government are prepared to be together. But there is, in a sense, a potential consensus around the need for profound change. If all it does is tinker around and look for some efficiency savings, then we haven't achieved anything. But I think we just need to be very, very bold at this moment.
Alex, can I ask you the same question? What do we take from the big society and what do we definitely not do again?
So I think my recollection of the big society was that it coupled two ideas together. So the big society, small government. I think those were the sort of the two sides. And I think there was a risk that some of the proponents talked as if they'd invented community work, which clearly there's a long history of that very community grassroots approach. And there's also a long history of people being sceptical of everything that services do, and this idea that if it's a service, it must be good. It's healthy to question that, and that's been questioned. And I sort of point back to the work of John McKnight and the asset-based community development movement. One of the idea of the careless society as sort of right back from the sort of 60s, 70s. I think the political side of that was the idea that in order to increase society, to grow society, you shrink the state, and that's a part of political idea. And I think it's important to separate those two things out, because that's part of political idea that people will agree or disagree with, but actually behind that, this idea that we should be growing communities and growing society, there's a left version of that, there's a right version of that, and in the charity world we try and steer our path between those two. So I think that if we simply shrink the state, and we've seen sort of austerity has had an impact on services. Yes, there are times when communities then step up into that space, but there are also times when they don't. It happens very unevenly. So I think we are looking for a different role for the state, but I think the last 10 years have really tested the limits of how little resource you can have in that. It's about using that resource differently, I think, rather than believing that if it's the state, therefore either it's good if you're on the left or bad if you're on the right. We have to be a lot more nuanced than that. And I think the optimistic point I'd make is that we are part of an emerging field of services that think in that way and that draw on that. What is that very rich history? So we're part of a network called Think Local Act Personal, which is a national government-backed network. And one of the things you can find on their website is this rainbow model. We drew it as a rainbow. It's a catalogue essentially of all kinds of organisations that share some values. So they're organisations which are strength or asset based. They look for what people can do first and refuse to simply see people in terms of their problems. That means they are by their nature relational in the sense that we're talking about. They think about the relation they want with those people, and they build community capacity alongside drawing on state resources. And I think what we're looking for is that mixture of, can we draw on the resources, the frameworks, the plan B that often comes with whether it's public service infrastructure or charity infrastructure, but can you do that with a looseness of grip that doesn't stifle that love, as we were talking about, or that ability to be creative and to care as an emotion, not just as a task. And I was just really struck by something you said about Josh McAllister's review and how radical it is to be using the word love in there. But it was a review of essentially bringing up children. If these were our kids, we wouldn't consider it remotely radical to use the word love more than any other. And I always feel that the two words we should be talking about most when we talk about public service reform are power and love, and they're the two words we feel most uncomfortable talking about.
You said we were kind of dancing around the edges with this, and kind of there was relational activity, and I think kind of Alex, you were talking about that kind of localised revolution led by kind of innovative people around the country. How can we make this true nationally, or what would you want a national government to lead to encourage this to flourish locally?
Well, building on everything that both Danny and Alex have said, which I agree with basically at all, I think we need to see this as more than a political project. we talk about our work and our contribution, despite the funding cycles that we're stuck in, which at the moment we're moving off 2 years of funding from the National Lottery. So we're calling this a 2-year experiment for a multi-decade vision. And that doesn't work with our political cycles. So we need political leadership. Like, I deeply, deeply believe in that. But like the work we did for Jo Cox around the Minister for Loneliness, that wasn't like, we need a top-down solution to a deeply personal lived problem. It was like, we need political leadership that needs to be representative of and lead some of the field around something that is true at the grassroots. And Alex talks about this emerging field, this thing that we also know is there, of like people who are ready to go despite the transactional systems, despite all the problems of working relationally. They're already there, and so we need to be led by what's already there, not assume that this doesn't exist anywhere, and it needs to be supported by politics, by government, but it needs to recognise that if we get this right, it's going to take 30 decades, and I don't think we're going to have any single political party in leadership for that period of time, so it has to be a shared agenda. And we have talked about sacred cows and the ideological differences that exist between us, but the thing that we all have in common is this belief in a strength of relationships as it's articulated in communities and in families. And if that's where we focus our efforts, this can last the course of election cycles and like everything else that can get in the way, and it goes beyond being a political, big key political movement into something that is like a kind of collective endeavour. But that has to be led by people beyond the state. The government, the state of the day, the government of the day has to root itself in what exists already out there, because that will outlive any political tenure. So that takes a humility that doesn't necessarily exist in our mainstream politics. So
you also said the words kind of like these things can sometimes sound fluffy, and kind of hard to be tangible. And I think it's kind of your point about the politics and the consensus that exists around this. I was talking to a policy lead for a political party recently about relational public services, and his challenge for me was, how do we make this contestable? And kind of what you're saying is that it's not about being contestable, therefore how do we make it happen as we're going into where politics is driving change? How do you make it a national project without the politics?
Yeah, well, I think you need to have people who are prepared to fight over it properly. And actually, with Michael Gove and Lisa Nandy, I think actually we have that at a really important set of topics around the levelling up agenda, which really means is about the distribution of power, nationally and locally. And I think they're both kind of on this sort of territory. And so, I mean, previous political eras have fought over freedom or over security, and I think we need to have this one fighting over society and community and the relational vision. That needs to be our contest, and to a certain extent it's about agreement. As I was saying, it is about saying who owns it and who has the best ideas for it. It's up to us to create the culture, the atmosphere in which the politicians operate, because they operate in very narrow windows that are created by the wider conversation.
There's also just that fundamental of the kind of challenge around the narrative. How do we talk about this in a way that, in a big society, was actually a very good brand, wasn't it, in terms of kind of giving it a name? Relational kind of like describes what it is.
Yeah, well, I tried all this. I tried to get this. I tried to get all this into Cameron speeches, and you would never have it because it just didn't have that purchase. So I mean, there is a branding challenge. Yeah.
And there's something. The thing that was really striking yesterday is got 100 people all working in very different bits of the system. The majority of whom have never met each other, and so they don't have shared languages, and they don't have a common sense of what one another's kind of approaches are. But what they have in common is a shared set of challenges, and the challenges that we know very well, those of us who work very much in the kind of relational space. It's the stuff that Alex and Mayday are kind of pioneering, which is like, how do you measure this stuff? In measuring it, do you ruin it? but how do you articulate the value of it for a system that says we want data and we want evidence and we want, and so like those sorts of challenges, and like the challenge we have right now is that we work in the world that we like work in, and we want to move to a world that is different. So we have to find ways to articulate in the terms that people currently understand why this is valuable, in the knowledge that hopefully we change things as we go. So that's just one, like that conversation. Anyone who works in the relationship space, well, I've had that conversation hundreds of times over at the grassroots, because organisations struggle to fund this work because people don't value it and they can't articulate the impact of it. Policymakers will say, well, until you evidence this, we're not going to put any decent welly behind it. And you're like, well, there's not enough money flowing through the system in the right way to generate the activity that generates the evidence that would give you the thing you want. So we know that it is partly measurement and evidence and articulating the value. It's partly will. Like, it's partly about, as you say, the narrative. Now, I've lost my train of thought, because I had something else to say after that, but I can't remember what it was. Your question was
around the narrative and how to tell a story. I asked.
Yes. One extra thing. Sorry. I think. So as I say, one of the things that united the room yesterday is all of the challenges we have in common. I think we can do some things to like try and solve that. Like we can cohere the evidence base, which actually Rebecca here from Ratio, they're doing some great work on that. Like other people are doing great work on that. We can like try and solve these collective problems that are bigger than any one of us, bigger than any single organisation. But also we have to understand that the majority of people in the room yesterday, people who are working in much the same way that Mayday are, at the kind of coalface of broken relationships, of like where they're missing or they're completely ruptured, and they're going above their nerve, they're going beyond the rules, and often they're breaking them in order to work relationally. They're connecting with other humans, like, you know, people putting their arms around children when it goes beyond the rules, and all of the other things that happen day to day. The thing that's even harder than that, the thing that's even harder for people working relationally, is the shame they are made to feel when they interact with a system that is transactional and doesn't respect that. So yesterday, one of the things that we really connected with, apart from all the things that we have in common that we fight against, is their shared experience of being in a commissioning context, or in a context where you're working up into a management system that makes you feel stupid for doing what is actually deeply instinctive. And there is something there around how do we recognise that even if this stuff isn't valued, it's to be nourished and championed, because it's Mayday and others who are really leading the charge on this and creating new systems. But most people working in these ways are working in them and they're not only breaking the rules, they're not only going out every day, but they're also being made to feel stupid and frilly and soft for doing it. And it's that then quells this energy, it stamps on it and it makes people not do it. So we need to like build the bottom whilst we create the enabling environment on top.
Makes a lot of sense, thank you. Alex?
Yeah, and arguably that's the system has become designed to do exactly what you're describing. I completely recognise what you're saying, and we have systems which we have a set of rules which we're so immersed in we can no longer even see them or recognise them. They just feel like the way things are, even though we actually know they don't work. And this is one of the sort of parts of the evidence trap that you were describing, I think, is we set an impossibly high bar for small initiatives to try and demonstrate that they can achieve big, hard outcomes around hospital admissions and readmissions and so on. We don't ask that of large chunks of the public sector system. So, you know, the whole of primary care can't demonstrate that it is currently the best way to prevent hospital admissions, and it spends quite a lot of time enabling people to get into hospital, but we take small community initiatives and expect them to be able to demonstrate that. And so we need to start being more realistic about the shortcomings of the system as it stands. And so actually we all recognise that. That's not controversial. We all know, and can, you know, anybody working in managing public services knows that the models we have are not consistently working well for all people all of the time. So we need to set that reality against the idea of changing things to do something radically different, because that sets the risk in context. What is the risk of doing things differently if what you're doing currently isn't working? It's not zero, but it's less. And I think this comes into this question of how do we scale it. So how do you take something that the thing that attracts us to it is that it's small, personal, relational, different, various, but we want it to happen for lots and lots of people. And the only way we tend to think of doing that in public services is through quite an industrial era model of scaling. We standardise it and we create a production line and we try and churn it out. We all know that kills it. But actually, if we take a more internet, social media age of idea of scaling, some of our biggest, kind of most successful organisations in the world are actually ways of creating frameworks which enable lots of people to have their own interactions that they own and that they shape. And I think we're looking for something quite similar in public services. So in other words, we're not trying to take a model that works and impose it on 100 different areas, but we are looking for the behaviours and the key values and how they translate into what people do and their expectations, and then we want to run that through our public service system. So integrated care boards have some potential to do that by saying, let's get all of these services together, let's get them out of their silos, and let's set some goals for this place around health and wellbeing. The reality is that lots of them have become a bun fight between various different parts of the public service sector, but the best ones like Harrogate and West Yorkshire ICB actually really get that and are trying to use that framework to have a shared set of outcome measures, which again you look at the level of place, population, group, rather than trying to use them to micromanage each individual interaction. And the final link I'd make is between, we talk about relational approaches, we've been talking about that as what happens when somebody is supported by somebody else, that's the key sort of thing, but we've got to run that idea of a different kind of relationship through the whole of public services and into those ideas of power and ownership. So if we have public services which are very large and which are managed at a very large scale, it's going to be in a traditional way, it's going to be extremely hard for them to enable those kinds of behaviours at the front line. If we look at models like self-managing teams, which can have scale but with power structures which are much, much more devolved, then providing again we're recruiting people differently and getting the right people into the right roles, we can have that sense of power and ownership running right the way through an organisation. So I wrote a paper last year called Meeting as Equals, which is about how charities could do essentially learn from what organisations like Mayday have done, which is to run the idea of being strengths-based, not just in the front line, but through governance, through fundraising, through campaigning. How can you put people in charge every step of the way? And then it doesn't have to be that battle between the politicians on the left and the politicians on the right necessarily. It's something about people's power and their ownership.
I'm very conscious of time, which I have spectacularly failed to manage well, but I'd really love to take a contribution from the floor and then perhaps one from our YouTube audience as well. Not yet? No? Okay, so any contributions from the floor? So.
Hi, I'm Lee. It's a bit of pressure to be the sole contributor from the floor. I want to talk about our local vicar, Sam Wells, who's the vicar at St Martin's in the Fields. He teaches moral philosophy at King's, and he makes a big thing about being with. He talks about 4 models of voluntary efforts, or being for, working for, campaigning, and he says ultimately it's about being with people. He actually would claim that being with is one of the prime teachings of Scripture. I'm not a Christian, used to be. So for me, what we did, caring for my little nephew Max, who had psychosis, Max identifies as F23.1, which is a code for his kind of psychosis. We created a poster, we put it up at King's, looking for a buddy for Max. And we got an aspiring psychiatrist who met Max weekly for lunch for just over a year. I would pay. And the point being that that's basically informal, low-key, not structured, and it worked for Max. But I get the point I think Alex is making, that as soon as you start to scale these things up, they will go a bit cockeyed. So to make my point again, Sam Wells talks about being with, so not seeing people as a collection of problems, but seeing people as rich in resources, what we call Aristotelian ethics, this idea of virtue. Let's just do good for people. Sorry if that's rambling, but I thought I'd offer it.
A lovely contribution. Thank you so much. I'm going to wrap up there.
I mean, I can stay if you don't wrap up, because I know I was going to leave, so I can stay a bit longer if everyone wants to. What should we take? If anybody else wants to.
So.
Sure. It's going to try and bring in what Alex was sharing about and then see maybe how it would apply in politics, just kind of imagining it. So Alex, I thought it was brilliant what you're doing and the kind of empowerment model in which it sounds like you basically go to the source of what people are dealing with rather than assuming you already know what's going on, right? And I'm wondering, what could that look like when it comes to politics? When maybe with MP surgeries, I don't know what it actually looks like for you, Danny, but when people are coming, I'm assuming that at some point they're coming with they're coming with their problems and they're expecting you to solve them, as if that's maybe part of your role. But if it was an empowerment approach to an MP surgery, how do you think you could actually lead people where you don't actually have to fix the problem, right? That's not your job. Your job is to leave them in a better place than where they started, right? And then that would actually take some of the pressure off the demand for politicians to be the ones who are going to solve people's problems, rather than how can we empower people in their lives, which sounds to me what you're doing so well. So that would be something that I'd be curious to
very. Can I thank you, Branch? It's very interesting because the surgery is a perfect sort of context for this conversation. What a surgery is, I'm afraid, is mostly people coming to complain about they've been let down by a remote bureaucracy. And I undertake on their behalf to challenge the leadership of that bureaucracy to treat them better. And that is literally my function. And my team, my caseworkers, they spend a lot of their time writing to the NHS or to the local authority or HMRC, I mean, whoever it is, saying and we don't have any power. We have to explain to people if someone's thinking that we can fix it, but all we can do is challenge the system to do the job that it's supposed to do. Whereas you're totally right, the model we would like to have, and it would reduce surgeries because it wouldn't be necessary for people to come. On the other hand, what I'd like to be able to be doing is helping to create the conditions of good relationships by helping people to step into the empowerment that they are properly due, and possibly just helping them navigate a system. In a sense, that would be a good function of an MP. I mean, of course, we do that all the time as well. But I think there is a third aspect to it. So if you think about a transactional service model that we currently all trapped in, a more empowered model in which the service user, terrible word, has greater agency. But there is a third aspect to it, which I wonder if you were kind of getting at as well, which is the role of the other person across the desk, whether that's someone in power or not, or just somebody in relationship. In my case, a politician, speaking to somebody and sort of encouraging them to step up into their responsibilities. And that is a difficult thing to do as an MP. I hardly ever do it because they haven't come for a lecture. But actually, if they have responsibility, if they have power, they also have responsibility. And I think, should I make this challenging observation? I'd be interested in people's thoughts. To have an empowered model, or a model of empowerment, that kind of entails people having the wherewithal to operate responsibly. I mean, the great, in fact, having criticised liberalism, actually the liberal revolution of the last 200 or 300 years very much began with the idea that people needed, the founding fathers of the American Revolution said we need, liberty is only made for a moral and religious people. President Adams said that. The idea of having freedom with people who weren't, as it were, fit for freedom, and the liberation movements in the 20th century also had this idea. Gandhi, Martin Luther King made the same point. You need good people if you're going to have freedom. So if we're going to have a model of empowered citizens, we need good citizens, which goes back to the point about virtue. It's a difficult thing to talk about when our model is essentially transactional and masquerades as egalitarian. Of course, it's not egalitarian at all. There's massive power imbalance. But the assumption that everyone is, automatically going to behave well, and all we need to do is serve them, is inadequate. So we do need to have frankly, we need a moral conversation around the reform agenda. How do we encourage people to fulfil their responsibilities well? Which is why I come back to this point about a family-based care system. And as I say, I think most people, almost everybody, wants to do the right thing, and our job is to enable that. But enabling, freedom must consist in some sensible object. So freedom needs a purpose. It needs to behave well. And I think that again, I'm trying to be challenging in this conversation. So I think it's easy to say let's restructure things so that everyone is free, has more agency. Well, they're going to fulfil the responsibilities that agency brings. Well, yes, I'm sure they will, but that's part of our mission too, is to create those conditions.
A couple of comments, but before I do that, I want to ask you, why did you mention that you were a Christian? Why?
Can I, yes,
Oh, sorry, we've just got one
sorry.
contribution.
Hi,
from the floor.
sorry,
Welcome
Alex.
to Alex.
Hi, I'm
I could
Becca
see
from
you were pointing
Ratio.
out, sorry.
I started. I'm Becca from Ratio. We're just down the road here, Somerset House. Yeah, why did you mention that you were a Christian in your story?
Because I think sometimes people think of ethics as coming from the church and a kind of shared ethic, and the problem is how we have a communal ethic which is not based on a book. That's an issue. I think that's the transition point. Yeah.
So you assume that we would be thinking in a particular way about you.
I'm a man of a certain age, and culturally that would be, and I can relate perhaps a bit what Danny was saying on there. So yeah, so we don't have, so to be explicit, sorry, we don't have so many common shared values. Honesty, for example, is not a universally shared value. What many people in my experience, are amoral familyists. They will lie if it does themselves and their immediate family good.
You did tell me before that you spend your days hanging out in Soho.
I do, yes, I'm very amoral, yeah. I'm a clown, by the way, yeah.
Alex, sorry, come back.
Were you actually
Oh, sorry, did you have a second point?
Yes, yes.
I'm doing a terrible job, I'm so sorry.
That's okay, no worries. Well, I have two comments. One was when you sent the invite for the event, and I read the question about why do relationships matter for public services. I wonder whether that was the right framing, whether the framing should have been why do public services matter to relationships. The much of what Diana was talking about of if you frame it in that way, then the focus becomes what happens in public systems, how can they enable relational working in, but particularly outside of public systems where most of the relating takes place. About 95% of the help comes from that. So that's just one thought. And then a question from what you were saying about this family point. I wonder whether if we consider that the family is the institution of care, that would be limiting or a bit, narrowing the whole idea of what relationships could do, because in a sense you would be defining relationships through the role that people fill in your life. So you are a dad, a partner, a son to someone, rather than the function of what those people feel in your life, i.e. they're there for you when you need, or they bring you joy when you do all sorts of activities. And so that made me think about, well, I think we need to have more clarity on what we mean by relationships, but also at what level they operate. And for example, in our work, we tend to describe 3 levels. What is the relationship between public systems and civil society? What happens then at the community level? We know that in some communities where there's a lot of relational working or relational being, those communities are healthier than others where that relational working isn't happening. And then the 3rd level is the one-to-one, what happens between 2 people, be them in public systems or outside of them. So we find that there's a lot of, would you say conflation? Is that a word? Like people conflate those 3 levels. And I think just we need to be a bit more clear about what we mean and at what level.
Thank you. Alex, I'll bring you in, but were you able to hear that, Alex?
No, so the last couple of questions got lost on the audio, I'm afraid.
Oh, I'm sorry about that. So the speaker's two points were, one about whether we need to reframe the question. So what can public services do for relationships rather than relationships for public services? And the second was about a deeper definition of the types of relationships we're talking about. Is that
and the levels at which they operate.
And the levels at which they operate. So Alex, but you come in on those points or the point you wanted to make.
Yeah, so I think it's all related. I was really attracted to what Danny's suggestion that we should start to think about this as having a moral and an ethical lens, because I think we talk about public service reform as if it's a purely technocratic, practical exercise. If we can just manage it well, then it will work. And actually, because of the ways in which public services express power, and particularly because of our growing awareness of the inequalities embedded in them. Everything we do in this space is moral and ethical. There is no neutral. So that idea that we might be, I think that Danny, you were talking about kind of, this is an ethical or moral question in relation to how do we want people to behave, which I agree with. I think the flip side of that is something which is one of the things I found most radical about working with Mayday and coaches is that we see that from both sides. So we recognise that there is also a moral position being taken by services and by the people who work in services as well. And so we need to be able to turn that lens back on ourselves, I suppose, to be able to not just say we want citizens to behave differently, but to recognise that actually there are a set of behaviours that, as I say, I think, we're ingrained with a set of behaviours and beliefs that sometimes we don't even think about. I was started my career as a care assistant in a care home, working with people with learning disabilities, and I was all of the things I remember there were this transactional idea of and ideas about professionalism, boundaries, me as this kind of neutral expert bestowing kind of what I had on these people who didn't have it, and actually that was a deeply moral and arguably sort of damaging mindset for a service to be constructed on that was also these people's homes. So I was in there in what I thought of as primarily my workplace, but actually I was in these people's homes, intruding in their lives, shaping their lives, exercising power on them, whilst also telling them how, and telling myself how enabling and how liberating all this was. There's some really difficult moral stuff tied up in that we need to be able to see from both perspectives, and of course we can't see that because we're not neutral. So actually that comes back to these ideas of co-production, co-creation, having people, and there's two key groups of people. I chaired a review of charities for the health and care sector a few years ago, and we argued that the role of charities was not to just to spend state resources. It was actually to help the state shape how its resources were spent, and we needed to do that by reaching two key groups of people. One were the people who made most use of public services because they had a huge stake in it, but the other were the groups and communities most excluded and oppressed and ignored by public services. Because you've got to co-create with both of those groups of people. And again, this gets into that kind of ethical territory. So I would welcome a much kind of deeper discussion about that. I'd also make an offer to Danny of this surgery question. It'd be great to introduce you to a coach or two to come and talk to you and your team about how could you take a strengths-based relational approach to MP surgery.
Yeah.
It would just be
Yeah.
a fascinating question.
Yeah, it would be. Yeah, absolutely fascinating. Okay.
I am going to wrap
Yeah.
up there. So I want to say thank you very much to our speakers and to our audience for taking part. Thank you all very much. And we'll be in touch about next month's event, which I think needs to continue the conversation about kind of what the conditions for change need to be.
Conditions of virtue.
And virtue.
The ideas as well.
Mm.
We're at the cusp of like, what does this actually look like? So we're really up for like having better answers than I've had today on like, what does this look like in the world?
Thank you very much. Thank you.